Welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast, hosted by Dave Roberts. Humanity possesses a unique skill, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. This podcast embraces that ability, offering learning opportunities through conversations with extraordinary guests. Dave aims to leave a positive mark on individuals around the world. So before you dive into today's episode, please share this podcast with your network, including friends, family, and colleagues. And please consider leaving a rating or review. Your support makes all the difference.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, and today it is my pleasure to have as my guest, Clare Loewenthal. Clare is an accomplished author, editor, and former magazine publisher who has built a life defined by resilience and purpose. At 18 years of age, Clare enjoyed a charmed and carefree existence. Less than 2 years later, she had lost agency over her body and her life and was admitted to a psychiatric unit because of a life-threatening weight. She didn't want to die but no longer knew how to live. Despite a long battle with anorexia nervosa, brutal medical treatment, and crippling social isolation, Clare transformed her life into one of professional and personal success. Clare was the founder and publisher of Dynamic Small Business, a magazine she grew to become the largest small business publication in Australia. She still holds the position of editor emeritus of Dynamic Business. Since selling the publishing business, Clare has written, edited, or contributed to numerous books and ghostwritten several memoirs. While some of her professional writing is still business-related, Clare's personal struggles have drawn her to projects that convey messages of hope and healing. The release of the second edition of her memoir, The Substance from the Shadow, now gives her a platform to address many of the misconceptions that reduce the very complex world of eating disorders down to willful vanity. Clare, welcome to the Teaching Journeys podcast. It's a pleasure having you on the program today.
I'm so thrilled to be here, Dave.
And I'm thrilled to have you, and we have to throw a shout out to Portia Booker. Portia, I've been on Portia's podcast before. She's great. She has her own very unique story of resilience, and she's just one of the master matchmakers in the podcasting business. She introduced us after she had interviewed you for her podcast, and she just thought we'd be a great fit. And one pre-chat later, here we are recording an episode. So,
thanks, Portia.
Yes, thank you, Portia. So, Clare, I suggest we get right into the gist of our show today to talk about, obviously, your journey and your challenges with anorexia. And I have some questions attached to that, and we'll just see where it goes.
Sounds good.
Now, your bio certainly outlines the challenges that have shaped your path and your passions today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for our audience to get to know who Clare Loewenthal is?
Well, if you look at the sort of personality that typically can have problems with an eating disorder, I'm probably fairly typical. I was a high achiever as a young person, probably quite rigid and a little bit of a control freak. But you asked who I am, and I don't actually think those things speak to who I am. I guess after all my struggles and all my battles, I would say that I'm a creative person at my core. I'm a very deep thinker, and I'm someone who really values human connection. I think that is the essence of life.
I agree. And without human connection, we can't live a full life.
And that was one of the things that my eating disorder robbed me of for a really long time. I was incredibly isolated. And that was a huge loss. That was something that in my younger years, I never got that back. Luckily, I reconnected with people later in my life, and I'm very appreciative of that.
Well, and one of the things you mentioned that I think is a key to understanding eating disorders is if we're going to treat an individual for an eating disorder, whether it's anorexia, whether it's bulimia, it's we treat the behavior and not at the expense of the self-esteem of the individual. You mentioned that the eating disorder did not define who you are as a person, that you are creative, that you value human connection. And I've always believed as a former addictions counselor that we treat the behavior and not at the expense of the self-esteem of the individual exhibiting the behavior. The behavior is always the problem, and that's what we need to address.
I agree completely. And one of the things that I think is quite a useful way for people to look at eating disorders is to separate the illness from the person. It's very frustrating to watch someone refuse to eat and get better. And I think if you separate that and go, this part of the behavior is the eating disorder, not the person, you avoid some of the judgment and blame that is often attached to anorexia in particular.
I would also suspect that, like any type of, for lack of a better way to put this, addictive disorder or self-defeating behavior, I would assume that there is a stigma attached to eating disorders. Am I correct in assuming that?
I would think that probably it is the most stigmatized eating disorders of the mental illnesses. And I understand that because it seems like such a simple solution. So it's often viewed as a sort of willful vanity, like if you wanted to get better, just start eating. It's so much more complex than that. But people are judgmental. I've sat in rooms countless times and heard jokes made about anorexia. People who didn't know about my past and, didn't think anything of it. But for me to have a lifelong struggle trivialized is very difficult. And you have to understand what a serious illness it is. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness.
Yep.
People die, and people struggle for a really long time, as I did. So for me, that was one of the hardest things. I was so deeply ashamed of my illness. I tried to hide it at all costs, which was hard because I was wearing it. I mean, people could look at me and see there was something wrong. And I would also say the medical treatment that I received deepened that guilt. The medical system attached a lot of guilt and blame to my illness.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think in your bio or your podcast outline that you sent me, that you underwent medical treatment for your anorexia, and that was pretty brutal. Would you care to elaborate on how brutal your medical treatment was and what the short and long-term ramifications were for you?
Sure. Probably I should start with by making a couple of comments. The first is that the treatment that I had is not nearly as severe now. So there are models that are similar, but nowhere near as severe. The other thing I should say is it saved my life. There's no doubt that I was likely to die if there wasn't some sort of intervention. Having said that, my treatment had a profound effect on how I viewed myself and how I moved forward. So what was that treatment? I was placed in a medical facility, a psychiatric hospital that no 19-year-old should ever see. I saw and had things done to me that no one that age should go through. I was put on bed rest and everything was taken away from me. They took my jewelry, my toiletries. I had no radio. There weren't really mobile phones back then, but no TV, no books. I lay in a bed and I was force-fed 7 times a day. The hardest thing of that treatment was I was to have no contact with any friends or family. So for all the months that I was in hospital, I was completely alone. Then when I reached my goal weight and I was told that I was cured and to go out and get on with my life, I really had no life to go back to, and I had to rebuild it from scratch. So it was a very, very difficult time.
As I was listening to you describing the medical treatment, one of the things is that you had mentioned that anorexia is a very isolating disease, that you felt isolated with your illness. And as I'm looking at how they mapped out the treatment intervention, I would have to think if that were me on the receiving end of that treatment, that would reinforce the isolation I already felt.
Completely. And there's a couple of things to say about that. One is that I wasn't taught how to eat other than in an incredibly structured way. So that's what I did when I went home to keep myself safe so I wouldn't lose weight. That meant I couldn't interact socially around food. So that social isolation became a huge problem of its own because I couldn't go and do the things that other people did. I was too ashamed. I felt too vulnerable. So that isolation was huge. And the other thing is, I isolated myself because I didn't feel that other people could accept what I had been through because I couldn't. I realize now I was projecting a lot of that. It was my own self-judgment about how worthless I was because I had allowed that to happen. And I remember my doctor saying to me, "Look what you've done, Claire. Look what you've done to your family." And I carried that for a really long time.
Was there any other impact as well, too, in addition to what you described? How did your friends and family react after you got out of medical treatment? What was the reaction? Is there anything else in addition to what you already said that you'd like to add to that?
Well, my family were really driven by an intense fear that I would regress. They had suffered along with me for so long, and so they were very protective. What they wanted from me was the old Claire, and it was hard for them to understand that girl was gone. I lost that girl in hospital. And so there was a sort of a pressure for me to be that young, frivolous person. But I don't think you go through trauma and come out the other end the same. So my relationship with them, food continued to play a role, as did their fear. And that's completely understandable. I was fearful too. As for my friends, I was so ashamed of what I had gone through. It was incredibly hard for me to face them. This was another one of the realizations that took many years, that no one was judging me. They might have not really understood what I was going through because it's a really difficult thing to get your head around. And I'm talking about the late 70s. So anorexia was less common then and not much was known about it. So I isolated myself from my friends, and that intense loneliness was one of the hardest things because I'm solitary to a point, but everybody needs connection. And I just had no validation from other people. And I'm so blessed that I have all these wonderful people that have come into my life later. Some of them know about my past, some of them don't, but they just accept me for what I have to offer the world, not the numbers on a scale.
Yeah, and when we can get that kind of unconditional acceptance, particularly when we haven't given that to ourselves or we've internalized events that have allowed us not to accept ourselves, that's empowering in and of itself. And I think for anybody who's had, challenges with addiction or with debilitating illness, I think knowing that they have that unconditional support from somebody who's willing to hold space for that individual or somebody who understands those unique challenges, I think is powerful and empowering in helping us step into our true selves and our authentic selves.
That is so true, but it takes an enormous leap of faith to allow people to do that. I think the way I coped with my hospitalization is I built up a wall around me. I had this sort of sense that they couldn't really get to the core of me. They could control me. They could control my eating, my movements, all my time. But the way I survived was to not let anyone get to the essence of who I was. And I think I continued that, which is such a shame, but that was part of my journey. At the point that I started to think, well, maybe this wasn't the most shameful thing in the world and maybe people could accept it, I'd test out one person and they would respond well, and that allowed me to move on to the next person. And I've come to realize that most people just are good. Most people are willing to accept that life knocks you around one way or the other, and they've had their battles. An eating disorder is an incredibly introspective illness. It was when I started looking outwards and realizing that other people had their struggles that I realized maybe mine weren't so bad.
Can you address, I know you mentioned in your podcast outline that everything changed in your late teens when you developed anorexia. Can you pinpoint any one particular event or events that contributed to your illness at that time?
Yes, I can. An eating disorder often will start during a transition period in your life. And that's what happened with me. So I left school and I was going to university. I wanted to be a writer. And so I got into a very well-established course, communications course. But it was a long way from my home. Everything in my life had always worked out for me. So it didn't actually occur to me that this might not be a good idea. So I left the city and my family and friends, all I knew and loved, and went to a country university. And the very first day I thought, what have I done? This is a mistake. The problem was I had never experienced failure and I didn't have any resilience. So I didn't know what to do with this. I look back now and I think choosing the wrong course isn't really failure. That's life. Many, many children do that. But my family structure was such that you're stuck at things. You didn't give things up. You didn't pick them up and then drop them. So there was this conflict in me that I was desperately unhappy, and I knew I was going to be that way for 3 years. I just wanted to come home, but that wasn't part of the fabric of our family. And what happened was I lost my voice. I became unable to say, this is what I think is right for me, and this is what I'm going to do. And that was surprising because I'd been very confident up to that point. But clearly that was a bit of a veneer. Deep down, there must have been a lack of confidence or self-belief that this shook me so much. I did come home. I didn't stay, but something had changed. My parents suggested that I went to secretarial college and got some skills and then got into writing that way, became a journalist that way. That seemed like the end of the world to me. For someone who had always just thought they would go to university and have this big career, the thought of going to secretarial college was pretty crushing. And I look back now and I think that's a pretty awful thing to think. But that's how I felt. And I just couldn't see a future. And in all of that, all that loss of control, suddenly I started controlling my body. And then I got a sense of accomplishment from that. And there was something I was pretty good at that other people struggled with. That period actually didn't last that long. I didn't have a lot of the body issues that a lot of anorexics had. It was actually never really about that for me. I think I just became so depressed when I came home, and it was the way the depression manifests.
Yep.
And that's one of the other things that I think is often overlooked. there are many times comorbidities with an eating disorder, be that depression or anxiety. For me, it was definitely depression, but I didn't know what clinical depression was. My family certainly didn't understand that's what I was going through. That was the kind of environment that was going on. And with my personality type, it's not surprising that that's how it manifested.
And you're right. And the other thing is we often overlook the other coexisting issues that are going on besides not eating. There's usually depression, there's anxiety, there's a lot of other factors that we have to consider and treat. And I think for a lot of individuals who are depressed, they don't eat or they'll eat too much. For
That's
women,
right. One way or the other.
yeah. For women, depression tends to manifest in terms of sadness, crying, tears. For men, it's irritability, it's anger. It may be alcohol abuse, but it just manifests differently. But the other thing is when you mentioned, at least now, you had control over something. You had
Yeah.
control over your eating. You couldn't control your parents' reaction to you coming home. You may not have been able to control what I can only imagine was a shame in terms of not meeting their expectations. And the family norm is saying, well, look, you do something, you stick with it. But here's the reality, Claire. I deal with college students. At 18 years old, they change their majors 3 or 4 times. So to have the expectation that a young adult, no matter how accomplished they are, no matter what type of resources they've had that have allowed them to be successful, to think that they're going to say, okay, I'm going to do this at 18 for the rest of my life is unrealistic because life happens. They develop other interests just out of a natural intellectual curiosity. And they might say, this path might be better for me than the path that I originally chose. But when you have those expectations, well, you pick something and you stick with it, I can imagine that when you must have felt like a lot of shame and just, boy, I let my parents down. And now I can't control what I did, but I can control what I eat. And this way I can channel all of that into something that I have control over, which is how I view my body and what I take into my body.
That's exactly right. And I think the other thing that was going on that is a little different to other mental illnesses is there's a very big physical component to your behavior and your reactions to things in terms of what's going on in your body. If you are starving, all sorts of things are happening. So an eating disorder is different to other mental illnesses because there's this huge physical component. It is very hard to have a sensible conversation with someone who's at a life-threatening weight. Your brain is starved. Everything that you are taking in, however small that is keeping your heart pumping and your body alive. But it is so difficult. I look back now and my behavior was appalling. I was trying to cling on to something. I didn't understand why. I didn't understand why I couldn't just eat. But if you look at a lot of the obsessive behavior associated with anorexia, which seems mad, it's exactly what people went through after coming out of concentration camps when they had been starved. If you look at all the ritualistic behavior, it's exactly the same. So your body is just doing what it is doing to stay alive. But I had no concept of that. So I just felt that my grasp on reality was just slipping away. And I'm sure that other people thought that too.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we mentioned before we started recording that it just isn't about gaining weight. Treating anorexia is more than that. I know you mentioned on your website that an eating disorder is measured by weight, but I don't believe it's the core of recovery. And I would agree with you. What do you believe is the core to recovery for anorexia? What is it that, as clinicians, as coaches, that we need to know if we run into somebody with an eating disorder? How can we best hold space for them?
I think the core, certainly for me, and I think for many other people that I've met, is identity. I think if you have any chronic illness, you become that illness. So for a long time, I was Clare the anorexic, and it took me a long time to rediscover Clare the person. And I think that's overlooked in treatment. I think that it's hard for medical people to understand that when you address someone's weight, you're actually taking something away from them. However devastating an eating disorder is, it is allowing that person to live in a world that they find completely unmanageable. And that eating disorder allows them to exist. Now, it's destructive and it has to be addressed, but if you take that away, you have to replace it with something. And helping someone find that replacement, I think, is key. Now, I didn't get any of that. I got a lot of therapy, but not along those lines. Not at that time. Later I did, outside a hospital setting. But for me, that key and that identity was creativity. And actually, when I look back, that's who I was as a child. If I look back to when I was really young, I was this kind of absent-minded, disorganized, creative little girl who told herself stories and always had a pencil in her hand drawing and playing imaginary games with her dolls. But I grew up in a family where those things weren't valued that highly. And when I actually then went to school and realized that I had quite a lot of academic ability, you get channeled into different things. And again, I went with that. I was a people pleaser. I was the good girl. I wanted people's approval, and I got that from doing well at school. And so I got channeled away from my natural inclinations. I tried. I wanted to do art. I was told that clever girls don't do art. And by the time I left school, all of that seemed to have faded away. But that's who I am. And it's taken me the longest time. And I've had many jobs, your comments about not really knowing. I've had this career that's kind of gone up and down and, I've done a million things, but I came back to my true north. And for me, that's writing. So I think that if we can understand that concept of helping people with an eating disorder to learn to value other things about themselves and put them out in the world, that's a very big part of recovery.
I agree, and it sounds like at a young age, the stage was set for you with the talents that you had, with your creative abilities and your inquisitiveness and your curiosity. Those qualities served you well, and starting your dynamic small business and ghostwriting as many publications as you have, being a publisher for a magazine. Those traits served you well. Those characteristics laid the groundwork for you being who you are today and being as successful as you were. Where those qualities may have been seen by others as, well, you're not a clever girl if you're doing this. Those qualities made you a very creative, a very innovative, and a very bright entrepreneur. And
I should say at this point that my father was a very well-known entrepreneur, and I think I got some of that from him. I think that the great thing was I was able to combine the different parts of me. I'm quite a complex person because I'm very good at business things as well. So to be able to combine them was such a joy. And that was another very important part of my recovery when I started my own business, and that became my baby. And it was a lot easier for me to have faith in what I created than me as the publisher.
Mm-hmm.
But being the publisher gave me the opportunity to go out into the world in a safe way. I liked Clare the publisher probably a lot better than I liked Clare the person at that stage. But I feel that I've come full circle. I kind of am that little girl, and I actually think that is the most interesting part of me. It might not be the thing that's brought me the most success, but I think it's the most interesting part of me.
Well, we get back to who we truly are, and if that means looking back at our past to find who we truly are, that's I think the magic in all of it. And I think knowing that we can celebrate our identity, who we truly are, what we truly want to manifest, I think is empowering, and I think is important to be able to be accepted for the gifts that you had.
I think so, and I think that's been a really long, hard journey for me, and that's what I couldn't see when I was that poor, frightened little girl in the hospital. I couldn't possibly have imagined my life now to be so free from all of my history, but also all the difficulties of the illness. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a second edition of my book, because the book finished at a point of time, but my recovery continued way after that. And doing a second edition and writing an epilogue gave me the opportunity to look at how far I've come since I finished the book and how free my life is now.
And you're speaking of your book, The Substance from the Shadow. I know that your second edition got published earlier this year. Am I correct? January 2025?
Yes.
What was the first edition about? How did you structure that? And again, I know you mentioned doing an epilogue in the second edition, but what have been the major differences, and what do you want readers from taking away from it after they've read your second edition of The Substance from the Shadow?
The book is chronological. So it starts with my parents taking me to hospital on that first day. And it just works through the different stages. It's 25 years since I wrote the book, so a lot has happened to me since then. I look at the end of the first edition now and I realized I was a long way from better. I was a lot better than I had been, but my life was still fairly limited. So I wanted to write an epilogue and update everyone on how I was traveling, because that's the story of hope. That people think that with an illness, you have treatment, it's a limited period, and then you're better. Maybe for some people, anorexia is like that. They flick a switch, a light bulb goes on, and everything falls into place. I've not actually seen that. It is a process. It's like most addictive things. I mean, people say, is it an addiction? I sort of see it as an addiction. It's a destructive habit that you have little control over that's badly affecting your life. So for me, writing that was saying to people, you can do this. There is always hope, no matter how long it takes. Some people might go, gosh, Clare, you struggled for decades. Yeah, I did. But it was so worth it. And I think the other thing that I wanted to kind of convey is that I remember being contacted by someone who had read the first edition of the book. And she told me that she had carried it with her for years and years and years. And whenever she felt hopeless, she would read it and think, people do get better. Now, I'm arguing that actually I wasn't 100% better, but she still took comfort in that. And when she said to me, well, now you're telling me that your life is immeasurably better than it was when you finished the book. How were you able to do that? And I said to her, I just tackled one little thing at a time. And one day I found myself in a completely different place. And she said to me, I have never thought of it that way. I just saw this huge mountain of getting better. And she said, that is a completely different prism for me to look at it. Just have one thing extra today. Just walk out your front door and look someone in the eye and smile and say hello, whatever it might be. And I felt that that epilogue was also showing people that you just got to keep doing it. You've just got to keep going out there, and however hard it is, keep trying. And that's hard when you don't have self-belief and you're not sure that recovery is possible. And I think we need as many stories of recovery and hope out there as possible. So when you're in that really dark place, you understand other people have done it.
Absolutely. And, recovery from any type of illness or addiction is never a linear process. It's like grief isn't a linear process. It's very circular. Our grief can resurface at any time. The triggers or the causative factors that contributed to any illness or addiction can always surface. And it's a process. And I tell individuals I tell my students at Utica University that, when we talk about addiction, is that sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or 4 treatment episodes for treatment to stick, for recovery to be something that a person embraces. And sometimes the best treatment that you do is preparing the individual for another treatment entry. Now, obviously, with eating disorders, you're talking about serious physical component to that. And I know, when you're talking about anorexia, hospitalization, particularly towards the end stages, is necessary with an interdisciplinary approach, with a nutrition, with a psychologist, with a social worker, with a psychiatrist perhaps, but it takes a team of individuals to take a look at all specific body, mind, and spirit aspects that affect that illness. It isn't like when you went for treatment back in the 70s where they force-fed you. If we did that now, there'd be a lot of places that would be closed, whether it's in Australia or whether it's in the United States, because that would be considered to be unethical treatment that is done against the will of an individual. So some of the things that have been successful in treating anorexia, any type of movement therapy, yoga, dance therapy is proven to be very effective. In the United States, we have the Renfro Center, which deals with a lot of young adolescent females who have anorexia. And as part of their program is dance therapy, it's movement therapy, it's a variety of different things in addition to just traditional psychotherapy. So,
And a lot of the things that I've explored that have been helpful are along those lines. I mean, it wasn't part of my treatment. It was just things I chose to do. So yoga has been very important for me. Meditation has been very important for me. Energy work has been very important for me to try and come to terms with the trauma that still lives inside me. To your point about it not being a linear process, I don't want it to sound like there's no remnants, because I'm still triggered. I'm actually triggered not around food, but around my treatment. So if someone tries to force food on me, I will instantly just go into this terrible state because it just puts me back into that state. I've had to learn how to deal with that and understand that. The difference is that would completely undo me at some points in my life. Now I'm able to recognize it, understand where it's coming from, and it passes very quickly because I understand where it's coming from. So that's something that I've learned to deal with the same way people who've experienced all different sorts of trauma have learned to understand how their body is reacting and why it's actually feels the need to protect you. Like it's trying to help you, even though it's very distressing at the time.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, too, because, we're always going to be dealing with trauma. We're always going to be reminded of our traumas in some way. But over time, as we learn how to manage it, it becomes less intimidating. We realize, okay, it's going to be a part of my life. I'm going to have to deal with any specific trigger that comes up, whether it's related to a re-expression of grief or whether it's related to a specific addiction or illness. And I just need to be able to prepare myself, knowing that this may happen, and decide how am I going to choose to respond to this, as opposed to having to make a spur-of-the-moment response in a crisis situation. It's planning and saying, being mindful and saying, okay, when this happens, what is my response going to be?
And unfortunately, you kind of learn that from going through it. for a long time it was overwhelming for me. But I actually know that, it's relatively short-lived and you get through it and you do learn to prepare for it and to understand it and that it will pass.
Yep. And in order for us to do that, we have to, I think, make friends with our past. Our past is going to come up. We need to look at it. But I've always believed that everything that's ever happened to me in my past or the choices that I made in my past have dictated what I do in the present and what I may do in the future. So the past is a very rich source of information. I think Soren Kierkegaard had mentioned that to the effect that life is lived forward, but it's best understood backwards.
Yes.
And it's something to that effect. And when you mentioned about the struggle, I was thinking of Albert Camus and the myth of Sisyphus, who was the Greek god who was destined to roll a boulder up a hill. As soon as he got to the top of the hill, the boulder would come down and he'd have to repeat the process again. And Camus said, what if we imagine Sisyphus to be happy? So I look at this in terms of struggle, and not that we're happy with struggle or something that we consciously want to have happen in this lifetime, but it's inevitable that it's going to happen. But can we imagine ourselves as seeing gifts in the struggles that we have to allow us to really come into our authentic self?
And it took me a very long time to see anything positive in what had happened to me. Part of that was it took me so long to forgive myself.
Yep.
So self-forgiveness for me just seemed impossible. I felt I had been given this wonderful, privileged, gifted life, and then I destroyed it. Now, I was sick, actually. I got an illness. No one would have thought, if I'd got cancer, that I should be blamed for it. But there seemed plenty of blame to go around if you got an eating disorder back when I was unwell. That was the first step, being able to actually forgive myself and understand that this was something that happened to me. It was beyond my control. Then I could start looking at maybe there were some positives in it. And there's still some parts of my treatment, especially, but also just my own behavior that I struggle with. But I do feel that I'm a very different person to who I would have been had I not got ill. And in many ways, maybe a better person, certainly a more accepting person, a more compassionate person, someone who can look at someone else's pain and really empathize, even if it's different. I think there's a collective understanding of pain and trauma, and it doesn't really matter how it's manifested. And I can see that in how often people are drawn to me when they're struggling, and that I seem to be a safe person for others. And that's a really nice thing to think about yourself.
And it also, I think, speaks to kind of the gifts that we see as a result of the challenges that we've had with our tragedies in our lives. And we can become compassionate. We can become more empathetic. We can become great listeners and bear witness to somebody else's trauma without judgment. We can create spaces for their stories to be heard. And the fact that you've dealt with stories pretty much in all of your career, stories are powerful. And one of the worst things in the world is a story that goes untold. And I think if we have a society, whether it's in Australia or worldwide, Claire, where we can make rooms for everybody's stories, bear witness without judgment, we would have probably a world that could probably be based on utopian principles.
I agree. And I mean, I've been so lucky because the first part of my kind of publishing career was all about business. So it was about making money, which, is interesting. But once I became a full-time writer, I got to tell other people's stories. And again, I think I could hold a really safe place for people as they were telling me those stories. It's a very revealing thing to write a book about your life, and for it to be authentic, you have to put the bad and the good. And I completely agree. Like, everybody has a story. Some people don't want to tell them in a public way, but there are a lot of people out there who have gone through something and feel that they want to express it in a wider forum. And I think it's such a privilege to be able to help people do that.
Yeah, I think it is too. When I have somebody gift me with their story of loss or any other type of tragedy, they're in doing that, they've communicated to me that I'm a safe person,
Yeah.
that they feel that they can tell their most intimate secrets to, that they can tell the most life-altering tragedy that they've ever had, and then I'm going to treat it with respect. I'm going to treat it sacredly, and I'm just simply going to try to help them come to maybe a greater understanding, or just very simply just listen, do whatever is asked of me after they share that story. But stories are what make the world go around, and it inspires me. It doesn't matter how long it's been since my worst tragedy in my life. Every story inspires me. Every story motivates me to be a better version of myself every day. And it doesn't matter how far removed from loss or tragedy that person is, or how far ahead there is. Every story I take away something from, and their stories become a part of my own narrative.
And I think that's being able to help people with that is such a wonderful legacy. I mean, that's something I think about quite a lot because I don't have children. So normally when you're thinking about legacy, that's what you're leaving the world. I'm leaving my story and hopefully other people's stories. And I think that's important.
Well, you probably have had a lot of children and adopted family members with every story that you've ever told, and children of the universe. That's what you got that are part of your family. So, in many ways, your legacy is already going to be left because of the stories that you've helped individuals craft.
Well, I would hope so. And I would also say that my life is filled with children, even though they're not mine. So I've had all the joy of watching young lives, and that's been wonderful. But I think I have dug pretty deep in terms of, well, who am I and what can I give the world? And language to me is such a joy, and being able to use language to convey emotions and help people express their truth is a wonderful privilege.
I agree. You've left us with just a lot of great stuff today about your own journey, about what we need to understand about anorexia nervosa, how we can best help individuals who are going through that, and what we need to understand. But is there any other takeaways that you want to leave with our audience today that would be helpful in understanding anorexia nervosa and for us to be able to treat it effectively as clinicians and as coaches?
I suppose that I would just reinforce the points I've already made, which is to never give up hope, to always believe that you can get better, to not see vulnerability as a weakness, but to understand that's what makes us human, to believe in the goodness of others, that you can trust them with your pain, and that you need to, when you get knocked down, you have to rebuild your life around the things that you love and that are important to you.
That's very good advice, very good suggestions, and I know that's going to be very helpful to my audience who's listening. And, the other thing I would also say that it's important to look at the root causes of any type of illness or any type of addiction, because unless we get to those root causes, we can't effectively treat the addiction or the illness. And that's, I think, so important because root causes are different for everybody. Like you had mentioned, body image wasn't really an issue with you with anorexia. For a lot of young females, it is. It's this whole thing about thin is in and body image. So they can lead to distorted body image or body dysmorphia. But for you, it was something different. And I think we need to be able to understand that even though physically, there is a similar process that goes with all individuals that have anorexia nervosa, the root causes are different, and we have to be able to treat those on an individualized basis if we're going to be successful.
That is such an important point. I should have thought to say that, because I was treated as an anorexic and everyone was assigned all the same characteristics and triggers and behaviors, and that wasn't the case. Like, we are people with an illness. And my situation, the things that led me to that point, were completely different to other people. And if the medical profession can see us as people, there are two sides to it. There are what brought you to that place and what do we need to do to address those so that you don't need this dysfunctional behavior in your life, that you can cope with the world in healthier ways. And then let's look at the physical side of it and what we need to do to get you healthy. Not looking a certain way, not weighing a certain thing, but being healthy. And that holistic approach is what's needed.
Yep, I agree. And I believe the wave of the future is going to be integrative treatment, holistic treatment. You're going to see the best of Western medicine combined with the best of holistic therapies to give a comprehensive mind, body, spirit treatment to anybody who's going through challenge, which I think all three are necessary in order for us to achieve authenticity and to be a productive presence in the world. You're preaching to the choir on that one as far as the importance of holistic therapies. And the other thing, the research on most holistic therapies that I've uncovered has proven that yoga, meditation, sound therapy, dance therapy improves body image, improves physical health, improves mental outlook, improves depression, anxiety. It's extremely productive and beneficial in those areas. So we need to make space for that. We need to make room for that. So,
well, especially with eating disorders where your body has been the enemy for a really long time, to be able to treat it with kindness and gentleness and forgiveness is so empowering.
it is. And when we can show grace to ourselves, that could be the most empowering thing ever.
Yes.
Clare, my last question for you. If people want to find out more about you, purchase your books, your services, what's the best way for them to do that?
The book, the easiest way is to go onto Amazon. So if you just go to Amazon and search for The Substance from the Shadow, it will come up. I have a website, which is just called clareloewenthal.com.au. Dreadfully hard spelling, but I'm sure that you'll be able to point people in the right direction. So that's the easiest way to look at what I do outside of what we've talked about today, and also to contact me.
Outstanding. I'll make sure all of that, including the correct spelling of your name, gets into the episode notes when we go live on both YouTube and my other podcast platforms. Clare, thank you so much for a very enlightening, very wonderful conversation. And I have to say, it is now, close to 7 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday at Sydney. And
Yes, it is.
Clare got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, her time, to do this interview. And I said, look, I'll let you, I can do this later, because it's right now, it's like 5 o'clock in the United States, now Monday. And for you, it's Tuesday, early Tuesday morning. But she said, no, I'm up early. Let's get this done. So I want to thank you for just a great conversation today.
It was such a pleasure, Dave.
Thank you, Clare. And with that, that's a wrap on another episode of the Teaching Journeys podcast. I'm your host, Dave Roberts, wishing you peace.